The Motion Picture Production Code was adopted in 1930 as a set of guidelines for the film industry in the United States. It was put into place by the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, under the leadership of Will Hays. The code listed everything that was allowed and not allowed to appear on screen for public audiences. The code was enforced starting in 1934 with the creation of the Production Code Administration, or the PCA. The code existed until 1968 when it was replaced with a rating system that is still used today. The Production Code was created to allow the film industry to self-regulate following increased complaints against the unwholesome content of films with the rise of sound technology during the 1920s. The industry feared government intervention and chose to direct its own censorship rather than face government interference. The Production Code greatly limited what was allowed to appear in films, yet producers eventually found ways around it. By the 1950s and 60s, changes in values and social norms led to calls for less restriction. The emergence of television, the breakdown of Hollywood's studio system, the granting of First Amendment protection for films, and the retirement of PCA leader Joseph Breen contributed to the breakdown of the code. The Motion Picture Production Code was created with the best of intentions to clean up films and to keep the government from restricting the film industry. Yet its strict rules and regulations could not last for long, as societal values and expectations for what was acceptable for viewing changed. Today, the rating system that is used allows for content to be geared more towards the age of viewers instead of the upkeep of moral standards for a single audience. With the rise of film as a source of entertainment at the turn of the 20th century, concerns arose early on over the type of content displayed on screen. As early as 1908, legal censorship was applied to films because of content that was deemed inappropriate. Chicago set up a board to control movies in 1908. By 1922, 8 other states had similar boards. Censorship boards did not just worry about content. They were concerned that theaters were places where undesirables gathered. The Motion Picture Production Code was not the first attempt in the United States to censor the content of films, but it was the first and most significant action taken to limit the entire film industry. As the film industry grew from the early 1900s, films were embraced by many but caused others to worry about the negative effects they would have on society. Social reformer Jane Addams wrote in 1912 that the local movie theater was a house of dreams that broke the blankness and grayness of everyday life, but would corrupt the minds of America's youth with filthy and poisonous thoughts that would leave them with a skepticism of life's value. Catholic priest Daniel Lord, who became extremely influential during the creation and adoption of the code, wrote that he was in the presence of a medium so powerful that it well might change our whole attitude toward life, civilization, and established customs. The code was not based on any research proving the effects that films had on people, but instead was based on the idea that films should support the moral standards of society. Research did exist on the effect of films on children, but it was not completed by the time the code was released. The Payne Fund studies, which were conducted from 1928 to 1933, revealed that the influence of movies on children was strong, but it was specific for a given child and given movie. Sociologist Herbert Blumer, involved with the study, stated that it is but natural that many should regard films as wielding a powerful influence on conduct because they may furnish people with ideas as to how they should act and what they would like to enjoy. This research was not available during the creation of the code, but it may have impacted the choice to enforce it later on. The belief that films could influence the behaviors of their audience was widely accepted, except by producers in Hollywood. Hollywood had become the main producer of films during World War I, while Europe was being destroyed by war. By the mid-1920s, films were big business. The greatest output of films in the United States occurred in the 1920s and 30s, with over 800 films being released in a year. Production, distribution, and exhibition of films was integrated under studios to maximize profits, and there were 5 major studios by 1929 that dominated Hollywood. They made more than 90% of films in the U.S. Hollywood's population rose from 35,000 in 1919 to 130,000 by 1925. Technological innovations revolutionized the film industry at this time, with the creation of the Vitaphone in 1925 to 1926 that allowed sound to be synchronized with film projectors. Studios started converting to sound and rewired theaters at great expense. During the 1920s, Hollywood stars became a part of American culture. The wedding of actress Mary Pickford to actor Douglas Fairbanks in 1920 was a big event, and an equally controversial one since both had divorced their spouses to get married. Hollywood soon became the target of heavy criticism for its unwholesomeness in the 1920s. A series of controversies led to calls for government intervention within the film industry. Silent film actor Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was involved in one such controversy. By 1919, Arbuckle had worked out a $3 million 3-year contract with Paramount Pictures, the first multi-year, multi-million-dollar deal for a Hollywood star. After the release of one of his films in 1921, he was celebrating at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. Arbuckle was accused of raping and murdering 25-year-old star Virginia Rappe, who died soon after the party. Fatty's career was over even though he was acquitted in 1922. Another controversy was the murder of William Desmond Taylor in 1922. Events such as the drug overdose of actor Wallace Reid in 1923 and the death of producer Thomas Ince aboard William Randolph Hearst's yacht in 1924 were other controversies that led to heavy criticism against the film industry. Not wanting to face interference with their studio system, executives in Hollywood favored the option to control film content. In an effort to get around government regulation, the film industry created the MPPDA in 1922, hiring Will Hays as its president with a salary of over $100,000 a year. The MPPDA allowed the industry to regulate itself and was backed by the Catholic Church and the film industry's financiers. In 1924, Hays released the Formula, which listed rules for films and asked studios to submit their scripts to be inspected. In 1927, he released the Don'ts and Be Carefuls, a list of subjects that were not to appear on screen and others that were to be handled with caution. However, these guidelines were not official. The Studio Relations Committee, or the SRC, was set up in 1927 under the leadership of Joseph Breen to review films. It was given little power and served a merely advisory role. Catholic fathers Martin Quigley and Daniel Lord were called upon to create an official code, the Motion Picture Production Code, which was adopted on February 17, 1930. The code was a 19-page guide with the following general principles. No picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. The code listed prohibitions against certain subjects so that moral values were upheld. Its main purpose was to eliminate controversial subjects. It contained information on topics including adultery, seduction and rape, scenes of passion, sexual immorality, pure versus impure love, murder, crimes against the law, vulgarity, obscenity, costume principles, exposure of the body, dancing, locations associated with sin, religion, and drugs and liquor. There was to be no promiscuity, venereal disease, shared beds for married couples, ridicule of ministers, lustful kissing, suggestive gestures, or sinful activity that did not lead to misery. Even depictions of surgery were prohibited. In the 1934 film Bedside, all mentions of bedpans were deleted because of objections to the vulgarity of excretory bodily functions. Films could not show direct injection of a needle to the skin because of associations to drug use. The SRC still existed to review films, yet if producers found its opinion disagreeable, they could appeal to the Producers Committee. The issue with this system was that most members of this committee were other producers who had similar interests and were therefore not strict with enforcement. Until the PCA was created in 1934, restrictions were mostly evaded and films continued to feature material that violated the code due to lack of enforcement power. The time between 1930 and 1934, before the PCA was set up, was known as the pre-code era, defined by production of films that still contain unapproved material. Whether or not a film passed depended on the opinion of the producer reviewing it. The Legion of Decency, headed by the Catholic Church, formed in 1934 and threatened to boycott films unless action was taken. The industry faced the threat of costly production cuts that would come with censorship boards or government regulation, and the looming boycott by the Legion of Decency, so the production code was adopted much to the dismay of producers. Producers had argued that the social influence of movies was over-exaggerated. Films were only entertainment, not to be considered as education or an essentially moral or immoral force. Producers believed that the moral aspects of film were incidental and were only a reflection of every image in the stream of contemporary life. Producers were pressured by financial issues, not necessarily their commitment to upholding moral values. During the Depression, producers were threatened by bankruptcy and had to turn to banks to stay in business, thus tying themselves to their financiers. Bankers wanted a letter of clearance from the MPPDA before they would support a film. Bankers strongly impacted studio decisions because they paid for productions and expansions. They expected a stabilized industry and wanted to deal only with responsible businesses. The code was a way for bankers to secure their investments. The code finally saw proper enforcement with the creation of the PCA under leadership of Joseph Breen in June of 1934. Unlike with the SRC, any appeal made by producers would go to the board of directors in New York instead of a committee of fellow producers. The PCA was also self-supporting by requiring fees for its services, allowing it to act freely in its judgment. Member producers of the MPPDA were obligated to submit scripts and films to the PCA for approval. The PCA listed details that violated the code for changes to be made. If the basic story was unacceptable, producers had to meet with PCA members to bring the story within correct provisions. After final review, the film was granted a certificate if it met the requirements. This certificate allowed the film to display the MPPDA seal of approval found in the early credit titles. Studios that released a film without it were fined $25,000 for violating the code. Once a certificate of approval was issued, the producer agreed to 4 things. 1. To not make changes to the film after approval without resubmission. 2. To display the seal and certificate number in the opening titles. 3. To submit all advertising to the Advertising Advisory Council for approval. And 4. To return the certificate and remove the seal from all copies of the film if any of these provisions were violated. The seal ended up being the key to a successful movie because without it, large theaters and most small-town exhibitors would not book the film. Life could be a dream. Life could be a dream. Eventually, the code lost its influence as restrictions loosened and values changed during the 1950s and 60s. After World War II, the country returned to economic prosperity. The studio system had broken up, allowing for more independent films to be created. Americans grew more skeptical of traditional religious values. and films were granted First Amendment protection in the Supreme Court case Burstyn v. Wilson in 1952. Another factor was the retirement of Joseph Breen from the PCA in 1954. Jeffrey Sherlock, his replacement, was a lot less strict with his enforcement. The 1950s were marked by increased leisure activities, the rise of fast food restaurants and drive-ins, the all-electric home ideal, adoption of television into the home, TV dinners, credit cards, teen rebellion, and conformity. Hollywood realized that the teen population could be exploited. With over 4,000 outdoor screens for drive-ins, teens were going out to watch films while older generations and families remained at home to watch television. The rise of the anti-hero and anti-heroine emerged on screen to reach teen audiences. Actors such as James Dean, Paul Newman, and Marlon Brando, and actresses such as Ava Gardner and Marilyn Monroe rose to prominence. Hollywood feared the growing influence of television and forbade their movies and stars from appearing on it. Theaters tried to bring in viewers with 3D releases, stereo sound, and widescreen viewing. Eventually, studios were forced to collaborate with television because of a decrease in attendance at theaters. Older movies were sold to TV networks to air, and the ban was lifted to allow stars to make TV appearances. However, because TV focused on family audiences, movies could now explore more adult themes. In 1953, director Otto Preminger deliberately released his film The Moon is Blue without an MPPDA seal, the first film to be released without one. Preminger's films challenged the code's influence and encouraged others to test its limits. Another first was the release of Island in the Sun in 1957, the first film in the U.S. to feature an interracial romance in which a white woman kissed an African American man, which violated the anti-miscegenation rule of the code. The 1960s were defined by even more changes to cultural values. It was a decade marked by assassination, race and war protests, the emergence of color on TV, and coverage of the Vietnam War. Film companies began diversifying to other forms of entertainment due to the prominence of television. Made-for-TV movies became a regular part of programming. The 1960s marked an all-time low for the film industry due to the impact of the TV. Traditional genres such as the Western now contain more violence and adult content. Social turbulence in the 60s with youth protest, anti-war attitudes, and anti-establishment questioning led Hollywood to respond to these themes. Film censorship was fading away. More explicit images found their way onto the screen, like in movies including The Apartment, To Kill a Mockingbird, Pawnbroker, and Blow Up. The new president of the PCA in 1966, Jack Valenti, decided to do away with the code because it was no longer relevant. It was replaced with a rating system in 1968, which is still used today. Ratings were to be enforced by theaters and distributors of films. Unlike the code, these ratings were not based on moral attitudes, but entirely on film content. The Motion Picture Production Code was created with the hopes of cleaning up films and saving the film industry from government control. Yet its restrictions were much too far-reaching, and eventually the code became outdated. The code impacted American films for many years and kept producers from expressing their ideas on screen. While the production code was set up with the best of intentions, it was unable to stifle creative expression that Americans embraced through the medium of film.